Hello again. I was recently awarded my Microsoft Certified Trainer badge, which I'm extremely happy about. Thank you to some of my colleagues at Cognizant Microsoft Business Group who helped me recognize that I was actually eligible for that. Just all I needed to do was fill in an application, and here I am. So I'm feeling somewhat obligated now to make sure I produce some more videos and continue instructing to hopefully on some interesting subjects for some people. I've put together, this is something I've abstracted from a piece of work I did in the day job over the last week. And it's around producing an Ansible running environment in a Docker container. And I've tried to add a few quirks to it just to try and make it super easy in terms of working with Azure and specifically, I guess, Linux VMs. It could be expanded for Windows, but I'm really kind of focused on the Linux VMs with this example. I'm going to be publishing this to my Git repo. I will put a link in the description for this video. But if you go to github.com and look for Omar McIver, you should be able to find that repo there. I don't have too many available at the moment. So I'm just going to, let me set the scene first. So I've gone ahead, I've created myself in my subscription. I've got a resource group here. And in there, I've just created 3 Linux virtual machines. They are on a VNet. That VNet is paired with another VNet, and that other VNet has a gateway. So I'm actually VPN connected to that gateway. So these machines are here. They follow a simple IP address, 10.1.0.4, 5, and 6 for the 3 virtual machines. And I basically want to show how I can set up an environment to manage those machines using Ansible via a Docker container. So first of all, before I do anything else, let me just make sure that I do have local connectivity to those machines. So 10.1.0.4 is there, 5 is there, and 6 is there. Now, eventually through Ansible, I'm going to look at how we set up Apache Web Server just as a demonstration there with the playbook. So let me just do a curl against one of them and show that there's nothing currently served on them. It should just time out. Hopefully it won't be too long. There we go. Connection refused on port 80. That works for me. Okay, so let me walk through this Docker build file that I've got, and then we'll walk through each one of the different elements that I've added to it to try and make the use of Ansible extremely easy. So I'm just going to go through the Docker file. I'm going to look at some of the dependencies I want, and I'll explain more why I have those dependencies later. So I'm using CentOS as a base image. There's a couple of language environment variables I want to set to force UTF-8 encoding. A couple of things break if that's not set. I'm not 100% sure why. I just know that I need to have it set so it's consistently UTF-8. On its CentOS, we're using Yum as our package manager. So I'm asking the Docker image to do a check update to install some basic dependencies there. We're going to install Python 3 pip, which is going to be needed for Ansible, wget, because I'm going to use that later on in the script. And I'm going to put in my SSH components, so OpenSSH server and OpenSSH clients. I should only really need clients, but I'm pretty sure there was one dependency I struggled with if it didn't have server as well, so I've gone ahead and included that. So once all those packages are installed, then I can actually use Python pip3 to install Ansible. So I do an upgrade on pip and then an install against Ansible. Okay, so once I've got Ansible installed on this container, because I'm interacting with Azure, there's actually some additional requirements needed for Ansible to work well with that cloud provider. So if I follow this text file link, and I just pulled this from Ansible's documentation itself on how to work with Azure, you can see there's just a text file with a list of packages. So we're going to use wget to quietly pull that text file, and then we'll use pip3 to install those additional packages. And then I'll just, probably not critical to do, but I just clean that file up. And then finally, I'm going to run this Ansible Galaxy collection install azure.az collection. And that is really just to make sure that all the Ansible features are there now, supported by the requirements for the Azure plugins, I guess, that are used in Ansible. Okay. Now, after that, I actually want Azure CLI installed as well. Again, you'll find this in most Microsoft documentation. We can run an RPM import to reference the Microsoft key for the packages. Then we can, I'm doing this copy here from this local file Azure CLI repo to my yum repos. This file just points to the URLs for the repos and the key. Again, this is just something I took from Microsoft documentation. I take it on face value and it seems to work. Once I've copied that file across, then I can do my yum install Azure CLI, and this provides the configuration to be able to download and install that package. And then one more additional thing I install, I'm installing a tool called expect. So expect is a way to, when you're writing a bash script, if there is a command that requires manual input, expect is a way to script that so you don't actually have a prompt in the middle of an automated script. Nothing to do with Azure CLI or any of the other packages, but something later on I realized I was going to need. Okay, so at that point, everything's installed. Azure CLI is installed. I'm going to be using the resource graph extension from the Azure CLI in some of my scripts. So I'm going to go ahead and actually add the extension here. That can be done dynamically by Azure CLI, but that just adds more wait time when I'm trying to use this Docker image each time. So I'll go ahead and add that now. I'm setting my user to run as root, and I'm now copying the home folder that I've got here into the root folder for the Docker image. Okay, so pretty straightforward, nothing overly complicated there from a Docker file perspective. Setting some variables, installing some packages, setting the user, and that's it. You'll see I don't have any kind of entry point here. This is a container I'm going to run interactively. That's something I want to bash straight into once I spin up the container. So there's not really much use of an entry point there. Okay, so I want to look at this home folder now to try and explain, what's so this clearly, if I bash into this now, I have Azure CLI and I have Ansible, but this home folder is going to give me those additional little tweaks that I've created to try and make this really super easy to use. So the first thing I want to point to, before I actually look at this script, let me just go back to my Azure configuration here in the portal. So I've got these 3 VMs. Now, when I provision these 3 VMs, when you provision a Linux machine, you can choose the initial user account to be given a password. You can even switch on Azure AD integration with it, which I think is in preview at the moment. You can also set an SSH key, and I like to connect using SSH keys wherever I can. So in order to do that, we create a public-private key pair using SSH keygen, and we will protect that private key with a passphrase, so I can have it on my file system and know that it's pretty secure unless the passphrase is known. And then the public key is what we actually want to put onto the virtual machine. So when we go ahead and let me just show that. I think this is obvious, but let me be clear. If I go and try and create a new virtual machine, one of my options here, where is it? I think it's under basics actually. We've got a username. I tend to go for Linux admin, whatever you want to use, and I'll use an existing public key. And I'll paste into there my existing public key. And by all means, I can share that with you, which I will in a moment, because it's a public key. And the only thing you can do with that public key is put it on your machine so I can access it, which I'm sure is not favorable. But why am I showing you this? Why is it important that I've used these public keys? Well, when we use Ansible, the primary method of authentication that I use is the out-of-the-box SSH authentication. So the way I try to make that nice and easy and repeatable to use, I'm going to store that information in a key vault, which is pretty normal practice for a lot of people. So I've got a key vault here called Azure Key Vault Linux Demo. And under my secrets here, I've got 3 secrets. So this is my, let me go back a level. This first one is my private key that was generated by the SSH keygen. The next one, I've stored in here the passphrase for that private key. So this is my actual password. So this is not on my file system anywhere. It's in my mind, but it's also in this key vault as well. And then I've also got the public key, and this is the one I can absolutely show you because this is what gets put onto the virtual machines. So I've put all these in the key vault. So I don't use the key vault when I provision the virtual machines. I actually could point to this public key if I was doing some kind of automation. But at this point in time, that's not how I've done it. I've just manually copied and pasted that in. Needless to say, though, because I've got this private key already set up on my local machine. So let me just show that. So if I list the keys, obviously this isn't the private key. This is just a snippet of what is in effect the public key. But the private key is added to my machine here, and I enter the passphrase to do that. Because I've got this on, now I can SSH with my Linux admin account to one of my machines. So let's do the first one there. There we go, straight in because of that SSH key. Okay, so of course, if I was to delete all my SSH keys and I was to try it again, it's going to give me permission denied. And that virtual machine's set up for public key access only, so it's not even prompting me for a password. Okay. So what's the point of all that? Well, let's go back to our script. So inside the home folder, which we're copying to the root home folder on the Docker image, I've created my own bash RC. So the bash RC file is the file that is automatically run when we start a new bash session on a Linux machine, which this container essentially is. So when this runs, let me start at the top here. So some of these are just basic things that you see anyway in a bash RC file. It's set up a couple of aliases, and then if there is an etc bash RC, then let's make sure we call that global file. The next thing I'm doing, I can skip over this pretty quick because I'm going to explain what they are, but basically I want an environment variable, a number of environment variables set in order for this kind of helper to work. And so all I'm doing in all of these if then else's is I'm just saying, does this environment variable exist? If it doesn't, output an error to the user and then exit. So I'm looking for a subscription. What is the name of my subscription, which is VSMCT in this example. I'm looking for an Azure Key Vault, which should exist within that subscription. So that's my AKV Linux demo. And then I want 3 secret names. I want the private SSH key secret name, the private SSH key passphrase secret name, and the public SSH key secret name. Okay. So once we get past all of that, now we get into the actual real work. I'm creating a variable SSH home, so that just makes it easier to use further on rather than repeating that value. I'm making that directory because on a brand new container, that folder probably doesn't even exist yet. I'm doing a quick export of a setting here. This is a little bit out of order here, but this is an Ansible environment. This is an environment variable that Ansible should pick up to use the private IP address. Have I got that right? Is it Ansible or is it Azure CLI? I can't remember. Let me check. Private IP addresses in Azure. No, okay, so no. So it's not. That's not to do with Ansible. Maybe I saw in the Ansible documentation. I really can't remember at this point. I'll show you later where I think it comes into play, although, a caveat there, I could be completely wrong. So back to the script. The next thing the script's going to do is it's going to call AZ logging. So as this is a startup script, you think about the first thing a user is going to get is a prompt to log into Azure, which is exactly what I want. I don't want any authentication stored in this image. I don't want to run the risk of leaving any secrets in a repo. So instead, I'm going to call AZ login. It's a bash prompt, so there's not going to be a web browser there. So it's going to give me the device code option to authenticate, which if you've not used Azure CLI, you'll see me using that shortly, and it's pretty cool, very easy to use. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to register the Key Vault provider. I probably could have done this in my Docker build, I'm really not sure. But I want to register it because I'm going to start accessing the Azure Key Vault. Okay, so this script now is going to download those 3 secrets. I'm authenticated with my user account now, so I can access this Key Vault and the contents to it. Okay, so I'm going to do an AZ account set to the name of the subscription, just in case it's not my default subscription, and I do have more. Then I'm going to call AZ Key Vault secret download, the name of the vault, the name of the secret, and then, here's our 3 values here. It's going to go to private SSH will be the private key. Private SSH pass will be the passphrase for that private key. And public SSH is the public key. Okay. And then I'm going to immediately do a change mod to 0400 for the private elements, private SSH and private SSH pass. Okay. Now at this point in time, my SSH folder has both the private SSH key and the passphrase available to it in a text file. Probably the most insecure portion of this automation, but it's such a brief moment that we're in that state that I feel okay about it. Because the next thing we're going to do, you see, we're going to first of all we're going to call our SSH agent, so we actually have the agent running. And then this is where we're going to use this expect tool. So all I really want to do is call SSH add private SSH. So add my private key to this SSH agent. So if I have the private key on this agent, I'll be able to access those machines that have the public key. But this SSH key is protected with the passphrase. And when I call that command, it's going to ask me to enter what that passphrase is. Well, I've got that passphrase in this file, so I can cat the value out of that file. And this is where this expect tool comes in. If I didn't use this expect tool, it would just hang there on the prompt. And I could manually enter it to move on, but I'm trying to automate this. So using the expect tool, we basically say spawn. So basically execute that command. We are now expecting to see a prompt that has this string in it, enter passphrase 4. So it's like a wait for this to, be printed to the standard output. And when that does happen, then we're going to send a value. So the value we're going to send is whatever we cat out of the passphrase file, followed by a new line, a carriage return essentially. Now we're going to do a sleep for 1 second. I've run into a scenario where this executes so quick and the whole spawned executable finishes before the SSH add actually has time to fully process that key. So the sleep one just gives it that opportunity to complete. And then the interact is just to say, okay, we're done at that point. We're going to be going back to the prompt. Okay. So once that's done, I'm now done with that passphrase. I don't want to leave that available. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that passphrase file. We can leave the private key on there. It's no big deal, but definitely we want to delete the passphrase for that private key. Okay. Then we're going to clear the screen. We're going to change directory to the root user's home directory. We're going to execute a script called help, which is nothing but a bunch of echo prompts, which is going to help me remember in the future how to use this container. And then I'm going to call the SSH add list just so that I can confirm that this actually worked and I can see my SSH key in this agent. Now, at this point, I actually think, there's a little improvement we could make. We could look at maybe, rather than downloading this secret to a file, we could probably use the command to just stream that directly into this send here. So there would be a way there to not even have the passphrase saved on this container, this running container at all. But I think it's fair to say that between this point here and this point here, it's relatively low risk in terms of exposure there. I mean, the person who's running this already has, Azure Key Vault read access to the secrets anyway. But, if you wanted to take that to the next level, I'm sure you could. Okay. So let me just show you the help file. So the help file is just going to echo out a whole load of things, and we're going to look at this now. This is just a helper to say, this is how you run an Ansible inventory. This is how you check basic network connectivity by, that's incorrect there. So basic configuration of hosts. It's not actually connectivity when you do a debug command in Ansible. It's just confirming the configuration is right in your inventory file. We could use the ping command with our SSH username. So that will be Linux admin in my case, and that ping will actually do not only the network connectivity check, but it's actually going to SSH into the machine to be able to do that. And if we want to run a playbook, that's the format of that command. And to run a playbook with variables, we use this -e with different variables, and we're going to go through all of these. But let me show, looking at the inventory file here, that's really what I want to look at next. So under this inventory folder, there is a Linux Azure RM file, and this uses the Azure RM plugin from Ansible, all that stuff we built as part of the Docker file. Now, what's important here is the file name must end with Azure RM.yaml so that Ansible knows how to use it correctly. If you follow some of this documentation here, you'll see it state that it's not just enough to reference the plugin. The file itself actually needs to end with Azure RM.yaml or YML. But let's look at how this file is constructed. So ordinarily, very plain Ansible, you would have a fixed definition of hosts and any variables that went along them, and maybe put them into groups or nested groups. Here it's slightly different. So we're going to tell the Azure RM plugin what information it needs to know to go and dynamically generate that inventory list. So a couple of things here. Source auto. It's going to pick up that we're logged in with AZ login. But if we did have a service principal configured in the environment variables, which is another option, then it would pick that up as well. We could fix that to only use one method as well if we wanted. We've got this include VM resource groups. Now I'm basically saying include all resource groups. So if I provision this for a particular subscription, so let's go back to our bash script. So we're going to log in, we're going to set the account to a particular subscription. So this dynamic inventory file will now include all VMs regardless of resource group in that subscription. If you've got a lot of machines, then maybe you want to be more particular with this and specify specific resource groups. Given this is an image for somebody to then execute and then use as a container, I tend to leave it as it is, and then per use of this, I might go in and just modify the file on the running container to suit my current needs. There's a couple of exclusions here. I want to exclude any VMs at all that are not in the running state, so that way I avoid pulling in hosts and then trying to run commands against them. That clearly will not work because the host isn't running. And then the other thing I'm doing here, because I am focusing my own efforts just on Linux machines here, I'm saying also exclude any where the OS disk operating system type is Linux. Now, if you want to know where these variables actually come from, if I follow I think it's on both, but I'm going to follow the Ansible link for the documentation. It gives you a an output here. For a given host, the inventory script provides the following host variables. So in here, you can see we've got the power state, and you can see we've got the OS disk operating system name as well. So that's where they come from. So there's obviously other criteria we could add there as well. One we're going to look at is name. That's next up, actually. So we are excluding anything that is not Linux and anything that is not in the running state. Next, we're going to say conditional groups. We don't just want one big long list of hosts. We want to actually be able to target different groups. And just to illustrate this, because I am actually just after Linux hosts, which is pretty straightforward. I'm calling out a scenario you may have sometimes. I don't in this example, but if you're going across all resource groups, you might have some AKS clusters there, some of the infrastructure clusters. And if you have any nodes that are not, machine scale sets or anything, they are just straight up VMs, then that could be pulled in here as a running host that is Linux. And our only way of really differentiating that is it has AKS in the name. I should probably refine that and say it starts with AKS hyphen, because that's actually strictly how the naming convention that's used by AKS. But I'm not going to come across this in this video, but I just want to example that's how we could have different conditional groups. So I'm going to have one group called Linux hosts, which is not going to have AKS in the name, and one called AKS Linux hosts, which is going to have AKS in the name. And the only one I'm going to be targeting with my playbook is Linux hosts. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to do is I actually want to pull in some additional host var expressions, right? And the way you've got to read this is the left-hand side is a host variable name, and the right-hand side is how we're going to evaluate the value for that variable name. So this first one here, Ansible underscore host, is actually it's a key variable name that's used by Ansible, and that's what it'll use to address the actual host. Now, that's important here because I don't want it to just dynamically build up a list of host names, because when I'm in this container here, more often than not, depending on how your infrastructure is set up, I don't have access to the DNS servers, the Azure DNS servers, or any other custom DNS server that actually has the host names in. And if you're working in an enterprise, there's no guarantee every host has a DNS entry anyway. So instead, what I'm telling it to do, I'm trying to point it to the private IPv4 addresses. Now, I think that might have been under the Microsoft documentation. No, maybe not. Is it here? IPv4. Oh, it's not. Okay, I failed there, but somewhere in the documentation here, you'll find some extra variables that give you information about the host. Private IPv4 addresses is going to be an array, because obviously a machine could have more than one IPv4 address. So all I'm doing is I'm doing a first against that. So get me the first private IP address, and that's what we're going to use as the Ansible host variable for the host, and therefore that is what Ansible will use to try and connect to the machine. Okay, and then just as an example, a couple of examples here. I've got Azure region, and I've mapped that to location. So that does go back to what we had here in the example definition. We've got location there, and then Azure RG I've mapped to resource group, which is right about here. Okay, so I don't think I'm necessarily using them in my playbooks at the moment, but I could now address in my Ansible playbooks Azure region or Azure resource group. Obviously, there's a lot of kind of J2 processing that we could do there if we wanted to be clever about these variables. And that's it. That's all we have in the inventory file. So this is going to dynamically generate on the fly our lists of hosts into these conditional groups, excluding these things we don't care about, and setting these variables for each host. So pretty powerful. Okay. Now, under my playbooks, I've got two very simple Ansible playbooks. One is a ping. All I'm literally going to do is ping all Linux hosts. I'm targeting Linux hosts. So if there were any AKS Linux hosts that were in this dynamic inventory, I would not be reaching to them at all. So I'm targeting it specifically at the Linux host group. The task name, I've named it ping, and the action is ping. It's just a built-in Ansible action. So nothing exciting there, but we'll look at that. This other demo playbook that I've got, again, targeting Linux hosts. What we're going to do is install Apache here. I've not tested this, so maybe a bit of trial and error, a bit of debugging on this. But basically, we're going to use apt because these VMs that I've got are Ubuntu VMs. I'm going to make sure that HTTPD is present, so it's going to ensure that Apache is installed. I'm going to make sure it's running. Service name is started. I want to make sure the firewall D configuration is set to open on port 80. Excuse me. I'm going to restart the firewall because if this does need to actually make a change, then this needs to be triggered. I should really be clear about that and define that differently, so it's only actually triggered if we make a change here. And then the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the index file content. So the default index file, the one that would normally say welcome to Apache, is normally at this location var www.html index.html. And I'm pointing it to copy from a template I have, which is files index.html.j2. So if I go into this files folder and I can find that file, you can see what I've got here is HTML, hello world, and in the body, I've just got this variable called index content. Now that's going to come in as important when we look at passing environment variables as an example to an Ansible playbook. But what I'm actually going to do as well, just to illustrate something, let's enrich this a little bit more by the host. Let's do our Ansible host. Let's say host is going to be equal to Ansible host. Okay, and then we will do region. These are all going to be the same value apart from the host across our 3 VMs, but hopefully I'm illustrating a good point here. And we'll do our resource group. Okay. So once this is run, we're actually going to pass in a variable to the runtime. And for these 3 here, we're going to pull those variables in from the host file. So that might seem like a lot, but I guess I just want to illustrate how I'm trying to enrich on top of this Docker file. You'll find similar equivalent examples in Microsoft documentation. But essentially what I'm trying to do here is not only create the environment, but I'm trying to use a script to make sure that I have my SSH credentials in. And then I've got a basic inventory that I can start from and easily manipulate per use case. And then I've just got some examples of playbooks here. So it's a great starting point to then build more playbooks if we needed to. I would guess more for remediation tasks. You could probably evolve this into something that you could use as a continuous agent runner. But my recent use of this in work has been around remediation. Okay. Now, one last file on here before we actually start trying to build this and see if it actually works. I've got this additional bash script here, which is called push public SSH key. So let's say when we run one of these playbooks and we are going to simulate this, that one of our VMs doesn't have the SSH key on it that we've pulled down from the key vault. Well, this is a script where basically it's going to ask us for the machine name, and it will be the name, not the IP address. And then it's going to ask us for a username, which in my example would be Linux admin. It's going to go and pull out some information. It's going to check the subscription ID and the resource group and so on. And then it's going to go and actually install the SSH key on that machine. And when I say install it, how do we do that if the SSH key doesn't provide us access currently? Well, we can actually use the AZ-CLI to do that. There's a VM user update, which is normally used for like updating a password if you need to regain access to any kind of virtual machine, Windows or Linux. We can pass in the username, the name of the virtual machine, the group that it's in, and then instead of setting a password, we can give it an SSH key value, which we will read in from the public SSH file that we downloaded. Up until this point, maybe you've wondered why we've downloaded that. This is exactly why. And what that will do is if the username I give doesn't exist, it will create that name, that username on the host. It will then also install this SSH key, and it will also make sure that user is a sudoer as well. So it really helps us regain control of a machine that, otherwise maybe we're locked out of. And obviously our Azure permissions there are what dictate that we're allowed to do that. So that's kind of end of the in-depth explanation of how this is all put together. Question now is, does it work? So I'm going to start by just doing a Docker build. I might have some cached images. I don't think I do have some cached images. I'm not even sure if Docker's running, so we've got to find out. Okay, so Docker is running. That's good. I think I may go ahead and pause this now while I wait for this to complete, because first time it may be a little slow just doing all the installations. Okay, so we're just coming up to the end of that build now. That was about 3 minutes in total for the first build. It'll be cached from this point forward, so if I modify any files, it's only going to do this copy again, which means it'll be real quick to build. Now we're going to run the Docker image as a container. There's a couple of things in here that I need to set, so let's walk through them. Docker run, I'm going to give it a name, Ansible_container. I want to make it interactive, that's a -it. -rm means that once I exit out of it, eventually it's just going to clean that container up and delete it. And now I'm going to pass in some environment variables. So I need to pass in the subscription name. If you recall, these variables are what are used in the bash script when it kicks off. So we've got the subscription, the AKV, private shared key, secret name, private SSH key passphrase, and the public key. So my subscription is VSMCT. My key vault name is AKV Linux demo. Okay, my secret name for the SSH key, the private SSH key, is this. Okay. My secret name for the private SSH key passphrase, oops, too far, is this. And the secret name for my public SSH key is this. So save that in a file somewhere, call it up and running every time. Okay, so let's see if this is even going to work. Okay, so it's echoing out some things there. It's saying it's got the subscription okay. We're basically just verifying the variables were passed into the script okay. It's telling us where we're going to get, we're going to get the private SSH key from that name, that name, that name. And now you can see this is where the AZ login is being called here. So we can now use this code. I'm going to pull my device login link. Okay. Okay, so it outputs my subscription with that. You can see there very quickly, you could see enter passphrase, which is basically this part of the expect command here, and you can see then disappeared because it handled actually sending that information in. So now it says this agent has no identity, so that's a bit of a worry. Let's see. Yeah, no identities. So I've definitely done something wrong there. Let's go into the SSH folder, see what we've got. So the private SSH is there and the public SSH is there. So let's see what I may have done wrong. SSH add, SSH home, private SSH, that matches. And then we're using the passphrase to send into it, asking it to sleep and then interact. So I think this might be a bit of a push, but let me just make it sleep for longer, just to see whether or not. I think as well, actually, I'm just going to take this help out. I had some issues with the SSS agent and spawning into other scripts previously. So let's exit out of that. We'll rebuild the image, which should be really quick because most of it's cached, and then we'll rerun the image. Doesn't mean we're going to have to log in yet again. That's okay. Okay, interesting. So I slept for a while there. I wonder if I need to do this the other way around. I think also just to be sure I'm pulling down the right information here. I think I should probably log in with the account I created these resources with. Bad passphrase. Very interesting. So I'm just going to go and verify that I actually stored that passphrase correctly. Bear with me 1 second. So I figured that out, and it was an absolute rookie mistake. So back in my secret here, when I created my secret originally, I actually just went in here and just typed it in. I say typed it in, pasted it in. Now, if you look at the help here, the Azure portal only supports single line secret values. Please use Azure PowerShell to set multi-line values. So my private key is a multi-line value, and that's basically, it meant it was coming back as a single line and had back formatting. So now I've got past that rookie mistake. Let's go ahead and run that again. Let's undo the changes we made here. So we'll build the image again pretty quick. We'll run it with the variables in, pointing to my key vault. Okay, we'll do our login with our machine code. Okay. All right, so we're in. It'll set the subscription. It'll set the key. Goes through pretty quick, and you can see now the line that says list out the SSH keys is right here. So now I should be able to SSH to 10.1.0.4, and I need to tell it that it's the Linux admin account because that's what it's installed on the virtual machine. So I'm going to add it to my known, and there we go. I'm in. That's great. So with that in mind now, I'll put the help again. Let's get our inventory using the Linux Azure RM inventory file. So this is my dynamic inventory. Okay, and we can see there's the Linux host. You see that Ansible actually appends, well, let's say the Azure plugin for Ansible appends some unique identifiers because it is possible across different regions within the same subscription to have the same host name multiple times. But we can see that inventory works. So let's go ahead and use that inventory, and let's run the debug command. Oops, if I copy that. Okay. So again, this is not really testing network connectivity. It's just saying it can process through the hosts okay, as they've been dynamically generated. And now we can check our SSH access by calling a ping. You wouldn't think ping relies on SSH, but I don't know, maybe I'm getting this completely wrong, and I hope not, but certainly I've seen SSH errors when I've tried to run this against machines where I don't have it. So I don't know if it's a reverse ping. We get those hosts to ping elsewhere. Anyway, we tell it it's our Linux admin user. The SSH key is already there. You can see it's gone through. We've got a ping pong for each one, so that's great. Okay, let me clear this and get that help text back again. Okay, so we're gonna, well, before we try and see if we can get Apache working, let's break one of these machines. So let's actually SSH Linux admin 10.1.0.6. Let's do the third machine. Okay, let's go into our SSH folder. Okay, and let's edit our authorized keys. So this is where that public key is installed that I have the private key corresponding for, so I can access it. So let's delete that. So now it's not on there. So if I exit out of that machine and I try to connect again, it's going to fail because that key isn't on there. So now this is where I can use this push public SSH key script. Let's see if it works. Okay. Bad interpreter, no such file or directory. Doesn't make sense. Let's see. I think that's just an error in my bin bash there. That's a shame. Let's build it again. It might be actually needs to take that line out altogether, but let's give it a quick go. Linux admin. Okay, so that bad typo there, but now you can see I still can't access it because that key on that VM has been removed, the public key. So now I'm telling it to push the public key, and this is going to use the AZ CLI to force this. So the name of the machine is LVM3. It was my third machine. Okay, the username. So I'm going to say Linux admin is the username. So it installs it to the right home folder. And then I definitely got some errors there. So let's have a look. What's the issue? Bad request, query is invalid. Okay. Let's see what this is. I was in a previous version using different variable names. So actually for this subscription, it needs to be this VM subscription ID that I'm querying out. So here we go again. At least you're getting a taste of how relatively quick it is to debug this. Okay. Let's just go straight for the push this time. Definitely something not quite right there, right? Let's go all the way back up. Linux admin, not a valid identifier name, uname. So where am I? Is that because uname is already in use? Which line? It's definitely a bin bash issue here. Let's try removing them altogether. So another, I wouldn't say rookie mistake, it's one that gets us all here. With copying and pasting this before I abstracted it, I actually had left the file end of line sequence as it was actually in carriage return line feed, which is a Windows standard as opposed to line feed. I guess it's not really Windows standard, but it's a known challenge that if you're trying to work in Linux boxes, especially something like CentOS, you want to just stick with line feeds, otherwise you can run into issues. So basically what I did is convert that to regular line feeds, and I rebuilt the image and I've run it again. So let's just confirm we still can't access that virtual machine. So Linux admin at 10.1.0.6, that was our Linux virtual machine number 3, LVM3, permission denied. No matter how many times we try, it's not going to let us in. So now let's go ahead and try the push public SSH key script. The machine is LVM3. The username we want to push the key to is Linux admin. Okay. It's found the virtual machine. It looked up its subscription ID and resource group, and now it's actually executing the AZVM user update with the Linux admin as a username, the VM and resource group, and then we're pulling in the public SSH key. So that's the very open portion of our key generation that we are happy to share, because if you want to take that key and install it on your virtual machine, it means I can access it with the private key. So that's succeeded. So now it's SSH again, and we're straight in. So we've managed to prove out, before we get into the real playbook stuff, how we can fire up this environment to get access to the VMs that have been created with the public key that's in my key vault. Go back to my key vault there. So as long as I keep creating VMs with this public key in, then I can access them from this environment. If I wanted to maybe not be so generic and not give them all the same public key, we could use some other naming convention in here rather than just having one value, and maybe we append the machine name at the end. There's lots of tricks we could do there. But very simplistically that works, and we now know we can recover if we don't have a key on there. We know we can use this script to push a public SSH key using the AZ CLI to update the user there. So now we're going to try the actual demo playbook, in which we're going to try and install Apache, ensure it's running, open port 80, open the firewall on the Linux box, and then try and auto-generate the index file based off of the host variables, so Ansible host, Azure region, and Azure RG. This index content is a variable that doesn't exist anywhere, so I'm going to try and inject that through the command line. So let's see what that looks like. So basically, let's copy the Ansible playbook line there. I'm going to set my variable first, so my index content, just say hello world. Our SSH username, we've been using Linux admin. And now we cross our fingers because I've not tested this at all. So if you thought the other mistakes were bad, let's see what happens here. One thing I'm concerned about is the package name. So this is going on to Ubuntu. So I think installing Apache 2 is the right package name. And I think then the service is still called HTTPD. And I'm not sure, but hopefully going to find out and hopefully it won't be too painful. Let's see. So one thing to note, I did make a slight tweak off camera here. Each one of these tasks has got the become yes, which is an Ansible way of saying when you run this task, make sure you do it as a sudo command, if you will. Otherwise, we would run into permission issues trying to modify the system like that without elevating our privileges. So all 3 VMs now are trying to install Apache, I hope. Okay, all 3 of them were changed. That's good. Okay. Interesting. Could not find the requested service HTTPD host. So that's pretty good, I would say. So we've got Apache 2 installed, so clearly I don't know what the service name is. Let me just do some investigation there. So Linux admin at 0.4. Let's just get into one of our boxes there. Okay. It would help if I complete that command. Status. Okay, let's try Apache 2. Okay, so it is there as Apache 2, so let me correct that. Let's just do a check to see if this is the right location. It is, so this is the standard HTML you would see. You know, the welcome to Apache. So let's exit off of that machine now. Although I've updated that in my source code, I actually need to update it in the playbook here, or I would need to basically rebuild and restart the container, but I'm going to be pretty lazy here. Okay, let's run our playbook again. Okay, Apache's okay. HTTPD is running. Python module not found. Firewall DNS Python module are not required for this module. I think basically the commands I've copied this from are not suitable for Ubuntu, so I probably should have sourced a better example. Let me go ahead again and just copy my changes to my source on the actual running container. So let's just take out the local firewall bit, see if it still works. Haha. I only modified changing the firewall. Sorry, restarting the firewall. I actually don't even want to try to add in an exception. I don't believe that's actually required, so should probably put a note in here to say this was incorrect for Ubuntu distros. Okay, so we actually have an error here now in the final portion, which is this creation of the index file, and it's complaining about the index content. So I'm clearly not passing that variable in correctly. I have an index context. So let me change it to index content, and we'll try again. I do like the way great software solutions like this can really call me out on very stupid errors. Okay, great. So now we're consistent across the board. So now I should be able to curl against. Okay, all right, so let's make this a bit more visual. go to 10.1.0.4. Okay, and we can see hello world, there's our host name, there's our region, and there's our resource group. So let's do this for our other two machines, make sure they're consistent. Great, okay. So now we can go back to our Ansible playbook and, well, let's run the playbook again and let's change this. Hello world, good night, everyone. Ansible do its magic. All right, we are in business. So that was a bit of a rocky road to get here, but I guess what I'm trying to explain out, and hopefully this is why you're even looking at this repo, this is a pretty decent start for a Docker environment in which you can very quickly start accessing a whole host of Linux VMs within your Azure subscription. You can do that dynamically using secure SSH keys that you can pull from a key vault, and the environment is pretty much ready to go. Something else that's just in the README here is, this Docker container that's running here. We might run a playbook where we pull some files in. So let's just create a dummy file. Okay, so I've written a dummy file there. How do we get access to that file because it's running in a container? I mean, this is basic. I mean, this is very basic Docker commands now. Hopefully this makes sense. So let me go ahead and copy paste, doesn't want to work. Docker copy Ansible container is the name of the running container. From my root folder, dummy, and let's copy it to, let's just copy it to here. So there's our dummy file. So I just wanted to show there's nothing great there, but I'm sure, if you're doing any kind of remediation work, you may, as part of your Ansible commands, your Ansible playbooks, just go and retrieve a whole load of information from your virtual machines. So this is where you can retrieve it to the Docker environment you're working in, and then you can pull those files out of that container before you ultimately exit and destroy that container. I hope this is useful. I definitely went in a lot of detail and exposed warts and alls. Yeah, if you find this useful, I hope you give the video a thumbs up. Maybe follow the repo and feel free to contribute.